Welcome to another episode of the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today's special guest is Ashraf Fagih, who is a writer born in 1977. He obtained a PhD in computing from Queen's University in Canada and was an assistant professor at the King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals. He began writing fiction early and published a science fiction short story collection, The Ghost Hunter, in 1997, and continued writing science fiction until he switched to historical fantasy. His novel, The Impaler, is in this genre and explores the Eastern origins of the legend of Dracula. Ashraf, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you so very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm really excited to go through the discussion, answer the questions, and express myself.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you on. You know, when we spoke earlier, when we were setting up this call, I told you that I really wanted to take advantage of the opportunity that to speak to somebody who's written and contributed to the science fiction genre by spending some time together to explore the genre broadly. When people think about literature in Arabic, I don't think that they typically think of science fiction. And I think I'd love to be able to change that and expand people's imagination of what literature in Arabic can look like. So let me ask you a biographical question to start with. What books did you love growing up? What did you love reading growing up?
Good question. I loved novels. I loved stories, definitely, as a kid. And this took me to novels and short stories. And I somehow got involved in attachment to history. I grew up in an era where we really admired the past and looked at it in sort of a almost worshipping it in a way, deep nostalgia. I'm talking about the ancient past of the Arabs and the Muslims in general, the Islamic Empire. That really was engraved in my psyche as a younger reader. So novels and history, which the combination makes sense now that I write in historical fantasy. But I got hooked also to science fiction at a younger age because I grew again in a period where that type of genre was popular and available. The Egyptians, particularly an establishment called the Muassasa Al-Arabiya Al-Haditha, introduced names that became household names over the generations. The late Nabil Farouk and Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq and Raouf Wasfi. May God rest all of their souls.
Yeah.
So those were the popular things roaming around. Those are the easy reads that you can just fetch off the shelf and enjoy. And that guided me definitely, and many of my generation towards admiring science fiction and detective fiction, intelligence type of action thrillers in a ways. As I grew up, I opened my eyes more to translated English literature. I read Edgar Allan Poe and Arthur Conan Doyle because I loved Sherlock Holmes. And then that took me to names such as simplified translations of Isaac Asimov and Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, H.G. Wells. And all of this combination, I think, directed my compass towards science fiction at an early age. I had an admiration for writers and novelists and authors.
Yeah.
I grew up in a house that admires books. We had our own library in the house. I was exposed to names at a very young age, such as Najib Mahfouz and Hussein Abdul Quddus and Tawfiq al-Hakim. Both my late grandfathers were avid book collectors and readers. So I had this what do you call it?
Exposure.
Crush on those writers. And you look at certain people at a younger age, and you wanted to you seek a role model.
Sure.
My role model wasn't a football player, although I love football, and I still do. It wasn't a singer, although I admire music. But I just wanted to have this, what do you call it? Fancy atmosphere of being an intellect and a writer. I'm not claiming that I am one now, but I just wanted to
you
get
play one on
into
TV.
that. Exactly. I just wanted to be one of those, where people just listen to you and admire whatever comes out of your mouth and read you and think and wish to be part of, get into your brain. So that led me into trying to write stuff. Now, why did I was fascinated by it. I grew up in Saudi Arabia in a time where our exposure to the outside world was not that. Think about it. The internet wasn't there, wasn't invented back in the early 80s, and the satellite channels weren't there at all. But we were exposed to Hollywood through VHS tapes. I hope those who are listening to me, Google it, okay? So films would be recorded on those electromagnetic, thin, slim films that you could play. And they were analog, not digital. And I would watch films, be it Star Wars or Jurassic Park later. And I would love to mimic that in my own language and according to my own understanding of the world as from my own culture. I'm not sure if I did that yet, but my claim throughout this discussion is that we still have a huge gap in the Arabic literature in fully understanding and adopting and reproducing science fiction in a way that is original, that doesn't look like a lame translation or a lame attempt to copy something that has been done in different languages and different cultures.
Can I ask you just a basic question?
Sure.
Can you define what is science fiction?
Oh, wow. Good. Well, the simplest definition is that it's a piece of fiction that is based on a scientific idea. But still, that's broad. I mean, you can write...
like, let me ask you yes or no questions. Yes or no questions. Okay. I'll use movies just because they have a broader exposure.
Sure.
Okay. Star Wars, science fiction or not science fiction?
Science fiction, but very loose. There's hard science fiction, there's light science fiction, soft science fiction, they call it. Okay. So hard science fiction is when you actually bring a theory or a formula and you play with it, and the outcomes of your film or novel are based on the like Interstellar, for example. That's a perfect example of hard science fiction. Star Wars is science fiction, but it's too loose and too so. In any work of fiction, there is an unwritten understanding between the producer and the consumer that I will bluff and you would accept it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Suspension of disbelief.
Anyway. Okay. Yeah. And the level of the quality is that the level of the quality depends on how conservative your bluffing is, how the sense of awe that you create in the mind of the consumer or the viewer. And this sentence, the sense of awe about the magnificent and the great in the universe, is a core definition of science fiction, answering your earlier question. When you read about an intergalactic empire, then there is this scary in a good way, in a way that respects your understanding and respects the major questions that you would have, that answer them in a way that is convincing, sort of. That's a sense of awe. When you read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and you realize that someone actually sawed off a a human being from different parts of dead bodies. And
Yeah.
it worked. It's alive. Huh? That's a sense of awe that would guide you to ask or re-question the basic answers.
Yeah.
I would claim that the science fiction authors nowadays are the modern age philosophers. They are the new Schopenhauers and the new Goethes and the modern Aristotles, because they and it's philosophy is not a science, by the way, but I mean asking the basic questions and trying to understand the essence of the world. Who
Yeah.
are we? Why do we think? Where are we going? Why is light? Why can't we touch light? What is it made of? What is the soul? Are plants creatures? Are they alive? Do they have souls?
Yeah.
Etc. Nowadays, we ask the question of what is the mind, and can robots dream, and should they lie? I mean, each and every of these questions will take you into a deeper and deeper. What is a dream? Uh, what is a mind? What is a brain? What is a conscience? What is a being?
Sure.
Etc. Etc. The basic questions about life and death again are being re-challenged now
Yeah.
with modern medicine and robotics, etc. So these are philosophical questions in essence
Yeah.
that are being pushed and challenged because of the extreme evolution of technology that we're going through nowadays.
Yeah. So let me continue this yes or no question to
Yeah.
understand the barrier. So let me summarize
Please
what I
break
just
me whenever I
yeah.
go crazy with my
No, let me just summarize what I think you're saying. So science fiction, at the core of science fiction, is it's sort of a canvas on which the author is basically testing the logical limits of a scientific concept, and sort of letting it play out and say, okay, well, if this is true, then that is true, and then that is true, and that is true, and using that as a playground to set a story in that reality, and like almost contrasting the reality of the human condition against this fantastical place.
Exactly, and thank you very much for mentioning the term human or people's reality, because this is the essence of any creative piece of work. And sometimes you read a piece of science fiction and you feel that it's so boring and it's so dull, as if it's a technical paper.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are so many works that claim to be science fiction works, but they barely brush on the scientific part. So they're full of fiction, but they're not scientific. They just mention a green alien here, or bring out just coin a weird piece of terminology there, and then there you go. Voila,
Yeah.
you get a science fiction. No, I would claim that most of the the work produced in Arabic are of that type.
Yeah.
They're full of fiction, but they're really weak in the scientific part. And that's the fault of the educational system. That's the fault of, or that's a result of us not being part of. Science wasn't a real part in our daily life. And literature is all about re-expressing your daily life in a way or another.
Yeah.
So Tolstoy and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Najib Mahfouz, what they did is that they wrote about everybody's life, but each has their own style and their own plots, etc. Now, in the West, in America, for example, which is the most relatable example, science fiction grew in an environment where science was part of everyday's life. So you had the Cold War, you had the atomic bomb, people were thinking about it and how it may destroy the world. And you had your dad or your uncle working at an atomic energy or generator facility. And then you had your big brother working in NASA, competing with the Russians to reach to the moon. And maybe you had your stepdad working for Intel or Texas Instrument, inventing something called the transistor that evolved to become the CMOS microchip. So these terminologies were part of not everybody's daily life for a considerable amount of section of the society.
Yeah.
We did not go through that. And I'm not saying this to put us down as Arabs, but we had a different route throughout that particular time. We had wars of independence. We had trying to identify ourselves politically and ideologically.
Yeah.
And that produced a different line of literature that we celebrate today. Tawfiq al-Hakim and Najib Mahfouz and Sa'dallah al-Nus and the great names that we all know in the 60s and 70s, Tayyib al-Salih, Buland al-Haidari, what have you. But we're talking about science fiction here. Science fiction, by the way, is not new to the Arab scene.
Yeah.
And I'm not referring here to 1001 Nights. Please, I mean, don't get me on that because...
Well, I want to ask you about that specifically. You beat me to it. I'm going to ask you this question directly. Ashraf, was Alf Layla wa Layla the first science fiction work in Arabic?
No. It was fantasy. And it pisses me, actually, that science fiction and fantasy are packaged together under one genre. I know that this is the case. I mean, it's a de facto. But George R. Martin and Tolkien and the other lady that wrote Harry Potter, okay, they're great in their own scale and scope in a way. But they did not write science fiction. This is absolutely different. Alf Layla wa Layla, by the way, had a story where there was a semi-humanoid or robot in the modern definition. But this does not make it a work of science fiction. It's fantastic, definitely. You have the genies and the flying carpets and whatever, the jinn. But involving jinn into whatever does not make it science fiction. It's fiction. It's fantastic. You can write a beautiful story. Edgar Allan Poe wrote amazing. Lovecraft wrote amazing. These are all icons in human literature that wrote amazing stories, but they are not in the same shelf as they shouldn't be, as Asimov and Heinlein and the modern new writers. And by the way, I'm just disclaimer: I'm horrible with names, huh?
That's
so
okay.
I'll be struggling with names from now on. No disrespect to anybody.
So let me ask you a follow-up question. If that wasn't the first, by your estimation, what do you think is the first important work of science fiction in Arabic?
Excellent question. Now, the importance may stem from one of two factors. The first is the name of the author. Maybe he's a heavyweighter who decided to try himself in the so-called science fiction. And the other factor is that the work really matters. It really falls into the definition of science fiction. Now, according to the first, Tawfiq al-Hakim, the famous Egyptian adib,
Novelist.
writer, he was a novelist and a thinker, wrote a science fiction story. It's called, let me just peek through my notes, في سنة مليون, in the year 1 million. He wrote it exactly 70 years ago, 1953. He wrote also A Trip to Tomorrow, رحلة للغد, in 1958. I consider this to be the oldest known. But the most prominent in terms of producing a continuous line of titles is the late Nihad Sharif. He famously wrote Qahir al-Zaman in 1966. Mustafa Mahmoud in 1964 wrote stuff. So as you can see, it's 1950s, 1960s. And this makes sense because these were the golden age of science fiction also in the US. There have been famous attempts by Jules Verne, of course, and even before, and H.G. Wells back in the late 19th century, early 20th. But science fiction became a clear stream of literature, and the awards of science fiction were out and were distributed clearly back in the 1950s and 60s. Yet these are all attempts, and up until today, science fiction is not I would use the word respectful, reputable genre, and this inferiority complex is apparent in the West, by the way.
Yeah.
So they would always claim, why wouldn't we see a science fiction novelist winning the Nobel Prize or the Booker Prize, for example, Man Booker Prize? They have their own prizes, the Hugo, the Nobel, what have you. But still, I mean, it's well established in the West because of the power of the market. So the market is there, and the names are there, and the influence, because of what I mentioned earlier, is there. I would claim that the influence of Isaac Asimov, for example, on the modern Western mentality is much, much more deeper and apparent than that of Tolstoy or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Although the two latters that I just mentioned are considered to be icons of human literature.
Let me ask you a question. So, like in the 60s, you're talking about this sort of golden age, this moment of some incredible production when it comes to science fiction in the West. And by my estimation, or by my theory as to why that's true, is because the sort of technological advances in two respects. One, it's really where computation takes a big step forward, and the role of computers, all of a sudden, it's not hard to imagine, oh, wait, we're going to be actually interacting with these places, and it's easy to extrapolate, not easy, but one can begin to extrapolate, oh, wait, this is where it's going. That's one. Two, there's the security state and the apparatus and the Cold War, and all of a sudden there's the impact of nuclear technology and sort of the security state. And third is the effectiveness of the space program, both in Russia and in the States. And there are these three things happening that could really, really, really get creative thinkers to start asking questions and extrapolating those lines and say, wait, how does this impact our human condition? What are the major questions that people are thinking through now? And what are the major questions specifically in the Arab world that are worth thinking through?
Nice. Well, some of my most favorite authors, American authors, are Blake Crouch and Andy Weir. Andy Weir wrote The Martian, and then Project Hail Mary, which are both, in my humble opinion, amazing pieces of work.
Amazing.
And Blake Crouch wrote Dark Matter, among other novels. So as you can see, we're talking about space exploration still. We're talking about quantum reality. And definitely we're talking about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I will add to that, we're talking about Earth collapsing or kicking us out, human, because of the climate change and us finding other habitats. But you might see already that these are all recycled themes that have been there. What's the difference here is how you are approaching these themes and how you're tackling them. The plot is different, and the plot is yet evolving, and the terminology is evolving as well. So answering your question again, there aren't any new themes differentiating what's written now in the West and in the 60s or even in the 40s, by the way. But the style is different. If you read Asimov, if you read Foundation, which I consider to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest work of science fiction ever written, there is lots of scientific dialogues, philosophical dialogues as well. The modern language is light into philosophy and more on it's faster and more on the action side. Now, when we come to the Arabic part of the world and what has been the case, I mean, these are all trials in a way, brushing the surface. Yes, Mustafa Mahmoud wrote about traveling through time and space. Yes, Nihad Sharif wrote about Earth being visited by aliens from other planets and other worlds. But with all due respect to these people who had great contributions to literature and to the intellectual life in general, you wouldn't feel that these works are genuine because it's apparent that they're trying to mimic something. Certain nations are famous of producing products that are copies of originals made in other nations. Okay, I'm trying to be politically correct here, and you will find this as a theme with the. But again, I'm not saying this to blame them or to put them down. There is a famous Soviet saying. It could be translated to the following: you cannot think about growing potatoes on the moon if you cannot find wheat on Earth.
Mm.
So, this summarizes our issue with science fiction. I mean, we have deeper problems with themes such as freedom and modernity and the notion of the nation and homeland. And all of these, understanding ourselves after centuries of being colonized by other powers. What is the definition of what does it mean to be an Arab? I mean, this is a big question by itself that deserves to be answered by, if I may say, classical themes of literature. But we can tackle those still. I mean, if we are going to conquer Mars soon, and as you can see, even the United Arab Emirates has impressive attempts in this regard. So the second or third generation of Mars inhabitants, would they still be Emiratis or Arabs? Would they still look at Earth as home?
Yeah.
Or would it represent just a myth to them? What about the fifth generation? What about the 10th generation? This has been tackled by Asimov 70 years ago. But it's still, I would love to see it being tackled by an Arab with all the emotions and the notions and the heritage that we have towards what we call a homeland. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if you saw this film, Costa Brava, Lebanon. Did you see it? It's they just put it on Netflix. No. And we had Munya, the writer director, on Afikra. She's a friend a couple months ago, last maybe 6 months ago. And it takes place in a Lebanon, not in the sort of near future, where it has descended even more into sort of climate collapse, infrastructure collapse, complete disarray. And it tells a story about this family that has sort of like retreated to the mountains and is trying to live a life there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, that's a common theme, by the way. And I think dystopian futurism is a very relatable theme to the Arabs due to the unfortunate situations that many Arab countries are going through. And I remember here the one very famous novel by the late Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq. It's called Utopia. Utopia was a rhetorical title because he depicted in that novel that came out, I think, in 2012, depicted what would Egypt be in the near future, specifically in the year 2023. And here we are in 2023, and I'm sad to say that it's not me. I mean, many people are just going through the novel again, and they're like, oh my gosh, we're almost there. But ups and downs are part of nature, part of history, part of societies. And this what was captured brilliantly by the Ibn Khaldun, the famous Arab historian and philosopher who lived in the mid-ages, our not dark ages. And Ibn Khaldun's philosophy of the growth and fall of nations was also, as they say, it inspired Isaac Asimov when he wrote Foundation back in the early 1950s.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this idea of local stories, like, can science fiction can it actually be local, or by definition, it has to be sort of a universal themes? Like, it seems, yeah, I mean, you know, any of the greats that you've talked about, I don't feel like Andy Weir, as you're talking about, right, is making American science fiction.
In a way, he is. When you write it, I mean, you can just feel the punchlines and the jokes and the plot itself. It's so American in a way. I mean,
For sure, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
at its surface, it is, but the theme itself. I mean, if it was written in Arabic, right? If Andy Weir was, you know, Tunisian,
Yeah. Oh,
and it happened to be written in Arabic, would it be fundamentally different?
It wouldn't be as catchy, I would say.
Yeah.
And that's see, the plot has, that is what I'm saying, the plot has to be original, the plot itself and the characters, all these elements of any creative piece of work. You have to relate, otherwise it would sound as a translation. It could be a good translation, you would still enjoy it, you would be inspired by it, but the question here is that is this how we, at the end of the day, you read for several reasons. You read to have fun, which is absolutely legit, and you read to understand yourself. Yourself means your own individualism, if that's a word, and the environment surrounding you. You would like to understand your countrymen, you'd like to understand why are we here. There have been, to answer your question again, would science fiction be non-American? Definitely. They're talking about, I mean, Afrofuturism, Sino-futurism. There has been wonderful examples of Chinese science fiction. The titles escape my memory now. That has been translated to English and just smashed the market in a way. I think I don't want to make a joke out of myself, so it's there. And there have been talks actually about Afrofuturism, as I said, and Gulf futurism, speaking of the GCC countries.
Yeah.
And Gulf futurism was first introduced as, or coined by Safi al-Marri, a Qatari artist / novelist. I would claim here, and I know that this is debatable, but the GCC countries right now are the most, the GCC societies are the closest to produce good Arabic science fiction, for several reasons. I mean, the themes that we mentioned, postmodernism, artificial intelligence and technology, and its availability in daily life, the space to race, even the dystopian thoughts. What would happen to us after oil? Should we go to nuclear from now? These are all real themes and real questions that matter in those countries more than others, to put it mildly. But still, I think the language barrier is still there. I would say that, ironically, good Arab science fiction may not be written in Arabic. I mean, you would have a Saudi author or a Tunisian author or an Iraqi author who is really influenced by what he or she read in English, and they would write and express themselves in English. There are many reasons for that. If you would write good Arabic, then mostly you've received a good classical education, a good education in classical Arabic. And that's one of the things that are holding me personally from writing science fiction. It's really damn hard to write a good science fiction story, huh? You need to be good in using the language as a tool. And you need to be good considerably in understanding the science.
So I mean,
enough.
Let me ask you another question. You're talking about sort of the GCC. For me personally, the most interesting stories that I would love to read about a future in the GCC would be written from the perspective of, expats, basically. So almost I would want it in Urdu or in Bengali or Hindi. For me, that is like really like GCC futurism, as far as I'm concerned, that's the most interesting, and sort of where we are now and where you extend it. That question is the one that is the most interesting to me. And so the question I have for you is, can Arab science fiction not be in Arabic? Could it be in Urdu? Could it be in English? Could it be in Pashto? Could it be in Filipino?
It could, and this applies to science fiction and to any sort of fiction.
Yeah.
Given the fact that there has been generations of people from those nationalities that you mentioned that grew in GCC countries and considered these countries to be their homes.
For sure. This applies obviously in where I am right now. I'm in Beirut, so obviously it applies to me as well.
I mean, Hanif Qurashi and the other gentleman who authored Hanif Qurashi, for example, is a clear example of an author who wrote about he's a UK author, okay, but he's of Pakistani origins, for example. There you go. And this applies to oh my God, I'm so horrible with names.
You're pretty good, I have to say.
I forgot about the name of the other UK gentleman who won the Nobel Prize of Literature while he was born in Japan.
Okay.
And this is recent. Okay, I'm getting older. What I'm saying is that the notion of home is becoming so fluid.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I would second you in saying that a person of a non-Arab nationality would beautifully express the dilemmas and the themes and the troubles and the daily plots of the daily life in Al Emirat or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. And they would produce lawfully their own version of these realities. That makes perfect sense. If I lived in Canada for 20 years, I would write about Canada, definitely. But it would be what do you call it? A flavored view of Canada, a spicier one.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like that's clearly where the region, in my mind, where artistic production in the region should go. And it's interesting because you're mentioning the language, and for me, it can't be tied to a language. The same way Afrofuturism, is Africa. There are, hundreds of languages spoken across Africa, and there's no expectation that it needs to be defined. Okay, if you're going to produce African science fiction, it needs to be in Swahili, or it needs to be in, Nigerian, no, it needs to be in whatever language you speak.
And it needs to. I mean, there is lots of great African literature that was written by people who are of European origins, but they spent enough time in Africa to get a glimpse or to understand part of the African, parts of Africa that they lived in.
So let me switch lanes for a second. I'd love to talk about some of your work. I mentioned at the jump some of the work that you've done. For those who are unfamiliar, how do you reflect on some of your older short stories? How have they aged in your mind? And what can you give a sort of a background about what you think they're about?
Okay, wow. I published my first anthology, my collection of short stories, like 25 years ago. I can't believe that time flew that fast. And of course, some of them are just horrible now that I look at them. I wrote some of them while I was I was 17 or 18 when I wrote some of those. But some are pretty good. And I'm not saying this to brag, but the theme is there. I mean, what I tried to do is I just wanted to try each and every theme of the genre. Traveling through the space, traveling through the future, cyberpunk, robotics, imperial galaxies, galactical imperials, empires. See, I'm thinking in both languages. I wanted to try each and every one of those. So, and short stories are easier in a way. And I deliberately tried then, as young and naive I was, to introduce scenes of the local environment. Like the heroine in one of the stories would wear a hijab, and I would just emphasize the fact that she was fixing her hijab while speaking. Maybe perhaps just to rub it in, in somebody's face to show that we relate in a way. But I believe that we as creative writers owe the society writing something deep and heavy about how technology is affecting our lives, because this is reality now. We're getting I believe that the line is blurring, is and that it's more challenging to write science fiction because we're getting there. We're here. I mean, there's a famous book, Where's My Jetpack? We're getting there. The jetpack may not be there. The laser gun may not be there. We're not at the Jetsons level yet. We're almost there. And soon enough, science fiction would be classical fiction. And it's not there. Meaning that most of the works that you read are not up to the level of answering these questions. How would social media impact us, impact love, impact al-Watan, home, impacts societies? I don't want to sound harsh, but whatever I'm reading, whoever is writing in science fiction, they're not doing a good job, in generally speaking. And this is not to blame anybody or to point fingers at anybody, but there is some sort of how do you translate the term istishal? People just take it easy. By people, I mean authors and publishers.
Yeah,
they are not as critical and sharp eyes.
There's a complacency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A famous author, a great author, won the equivalent to the Arab Booker Prize in the previous year on a novel that was classified under the genre of science fiction. In my humble opinion, it's no good. But it just shows you that there is eagerness. It was good that something claimed to be science fiction was honored with such a prestigious prize. But the novel sucks, actually, technically speaking. And I'm entitled to my opinion as a reader, huh?
Of course you are. So I want to switch gears and let's do the quick Q&A and then we'll wrap up.
Sure.
So our first question is, what are you reading or watching these days?
What I'm reading? I'm reading like 4 novels or 4 books at the same time, which is a habit that I have. They're both written in audio format. And I'm reading The Silk Road by Peter Franco Palm, I think. It's a famous book, and of course the reason is that I'm here in China, so I had to educate myself about The Silk Road. I'm reading the biography on Lionel Messi.
Nice.
And I'm reading 2 novels, واحة الغروب, 2 Arabic novels, the late Baha Tahir, and حرب الكلب الثانية, The Second War of the Dog, by the Palestinian author Ibrahim Nasrallah. So I'm shifting between this and that. Obviously, I have a very busy mind, and I try to make it busier and busier.
Yeah.
What am I watching? On Netflix, I just a couple of days ago watched a beautiful film that I loved. It's called The Pale Blue Eye. And it has Christian Bale in it. And it surprised me that it introduces the famous author Edgar Allan Poe. I didn't know that he went to West Point Military Academy. But it did, and it seems that the author of that film or novel basically took the liberty of twisting the life of Poe a little bit to fit his plot.
Yeah.
Lovely film, lovely film.
Cool. Now that you mentioned Netflix, I wanted to ask you, what role do you think the prevalence of these types of streaming services and the ease with which it's people are able to make feature films and series, given technology, what effect do you think it's having on the genre, the science fiction genre, in the Arab world specifically?
Since I'm getting older and grumpier, I'm going to give a pessimistic point of view.
Please.
They say the more the merrier, but I mean, having the opportunity or having this heavy demand to produce more and more and more will have its toll on quality, definitely. It has been the case historically, of course. There are always good films, bad films, good series, bad series. But now, if you can, while having all of these, I'm not limiting it to Netflix. There's Hulu, there's Disney Plus, there's Apple Plus, what have you. So now you are exposed literally every week to hundreds of new titles. That would be it would be really challenging to stand out. You would end up having great works, but very few, and much bigger number of mediocre to bad works. And you can see it. I mean, you can see it and feel it. You would watch the first episode of a series and you would know exactly what's happening because, come on, I mean, there's only few directions where this could go. This is more apparent in the Arab world and on Arab drama because the industry is still growing. I mean, except for a certain number of countries, Egypt, maybe Lebanon, Syria in the old days, you don't have a really mature industry. Iraq was there back in the 70s and 80s. But yet, so you will end up with lighter works, speaking to younger generations. And I'm not saying that younger generation, I'm not putting them down. I'm not saying that teenagers are less intellectual or they're having a worse taste than the others, but they are looking to a certain dose of creativity that is what producers are looking for and what are they feeding the streaming platforms with. So you will end up with lots of light comedy, light action, sort of fast food visual productions, and that would be the main line. Martin Scorsese shares my opinion. He's like fed up with all of these superhero.
Yeah, of course. He says it's not cinema. But it is. At the end of the day, this is what we have. So the past 20 years are marked by these productions, whether you like it or not. And the same goes with the days when Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone were there. I mean, that was bad cinema. Yeah. But it was the dominant genre. Let me ask you.
We have, sure, go ahead.
No, I want to ask you another question before we continue with the quick Q&A. I want to ask you about a really important book, and I'm curious if you think it is science fiction. So let me ask you: do you think Cities of Salt, the series, is science fiction, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, given your day job as well?
Yeah, مدن الملح by the late Abdurrahman Munif isn't science fiction. I think it's one of the most authentic and original works that describes the history of Saudi Arabia. Not the history, the story of modern Saudi Arabia. I would, especially the first book. It's 5 novels, مدن الملح. But the first one is the most touching to me, I think. Abdurrahman Munif is the Najib Mahfouz of Saudi Arabia because of that book. It's not science fiction, but it depicted really that shift between the Bedouin style life in certain regions of the Arabian Peninsula, and modernity because of the discovery of oil. And to me, it's a work of its own. It's in a league of its own.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep on going. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I thought a lot about this question when you shared it with me. Thank you for not surprising me with these questions. And I think I would shadow someone who would be really successful in both in his writing and managing their time, because this is the most grueling challenges I'm facing, how to manage my time right. And the best example here is Najib Mahfouz. I would love to shadow him for not a day, maybe a week or a month. Especially that they say that Najib Mahfouz had a secret life, huh? I mean, he would disappear for a while to do whatever he does, and yet he had a day job, and then he would enjoy his life with his friends and pals in al-qahwa or the cafe or what you call it, and he would write in a very systematic way, keeping a folder for each character of his novels or stories. I'd love and his pals were like Abbas Mahmoud al-Aqad and Tawfiq al-Hakim and Ihsan Abdul Quddus and Yusuf Idris. I mean, oh my God, just a pool of legends. What would they do together? How would they talk and argue? And how would they deal with each other as geniuses? Wouldn't the thought of killing each other cross their minds in a way? Wasn't jealousy there? I would just love to live a day in that period of time, which was the 50s and 60s of the last century, by the way.
Amazing. What do you think people most misunderstand about your work?
When I published The Impaler, and I love the English translation because it's more decent than the Arabic name. The Arabic title is Al-Mukhawziq. And that awful name, it was actually the title of the person who inspired Bram Stoker to write Dracula. So I wrote the original story in a way, and Count Vlad Dracula was the arch nemesis of Sultan Muhammad II, Muhammad the Conqueror. And that's a wow moment that inspired me to write. And these wow moments are always the fuel that push me to write. Anywho, so I write the story in an environment or atmosphere where the Ottomans were there, and people had two opinions. They either accused me of being a loyal Ottoman, trying to polish the Ottoman history, and where others accused me of the absolute opposite. And I think this is a famous gap that people fall in whenever reading fictional history, because we deal with history in a very respectful manner. We are afraid of playing with history or looking for alternative narratives of history. It's a tricky business. It's like walking in a landmine. And that's something that so whenever I write about historical fiction, I get under the hammer of those readers who are expecting to read a certain narrative and are not happy with. They assume that I have an agenda. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
While I don't, I just try to be honest to the plot.
You know you're doing something right if people on both sides don't like what you're doing. So
I think it is the case. Yeah, I like to pinch people in a way and just ask them to re-question whatever they know.
Yeah. Okay. The last question before we wrap up is, whose work do you admire or are inspired by? I'm sure there's a long list. So if you pick one or two.
The list is dynamic, by the way. Amin Ma'louf is definitely a big name that I always mention whenever I'm asked. And there is the late Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq, definitely, who I mentioned several times. Isaac Asimov is always there. And he's the guy who established these worlds that we read and enjoy, iRobot, Foundation, etc. Recently or lately, I've read the novel Ishmael by the late Daniel Quinn, and that novel just messed up my mind. I mean, so he's a new source of inspiration, Daniel Quinn, that I really love what he wrote. The list is big, definitely, but I'm going to just limit it to those.
Cool. Well, Ashraf, thanks so much for taking the time to educate us and answer all my questions. It's definitely a genre that I think is ripe for growth in the region. I hope it is. And I thank you for your work.
Thank you so very much for this wonderful conversation. I appreciate it. And thank you for the professional level of preparation. Please do convey my salams to Tamara and the team.
For sure.
And I'd love to receive questions from those who are following on my Instagram account, which is short.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those listening to the podcast, Ashraf's Instagram is ASHRAF_FAGIH. And I really do appreciate it tremendously. Thanks so much.
Thank you and good night.